Good evening, everyone. My name is William Von Handorf, and I'm a junior here at the McConnell Center. Tonight it is my privilege to welcome everyone to McConnell Center, both those in attendance as well as those joining virtually on YouTube. Tonight's event is part of the McConnell Center to read and reflect upon Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. We are doing an analysis of Tocqueville's study of America. You can find more information, including reading guides, podcasts, and in this series at www.mcconnellcenter.org. Tonight, it is our honor to host Tracy McKenzie as he discusses what Tocqueville had to say about the relationship between our religious beliefs, our practices, and the health of our democratic institutions. Dr. McKenzie is a professor of history, and he holds the Arthur Holmes Chair of Faith and Learning at Wheaton College. He has received distinguished teaching awards from the University of Washington as well as Wheaton College, and he's the author of numerous books and articles, including his most recent, We the People, the Founders and the Future of American Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Tracy McKenzie.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Will, for that introduction. For the last, 10 minutes, I'm talking to Dr. Gregg, and he's been continuing, lower your expectations, lower your expectations. He's telling me this horror story of a talk to 3 people or something like that. And this is a good group. I'm thankful to see you all. I'm assuming you're not football fans, or I am glad that you're here. I enjoyed my time last night. For those of you that were part of the seminar, I just appreciated that so much. I think I had the expectation coming tonight that there would be not perfect, but a lot of overlap with last night's group. And I was going to build a lot on what I shared in the seminar. But as I look around the room, actually, I recognize Jacob, right? And I saw Dylan over here and Will, and I remember Piper. I'm not sure if I recognize anyone else, and Allie in the back. So is everyone else? No. Grant? No, not Grant. You sat next to Grant. What is your name? Thank you, Seth. All right. So everyone else is here that was not at the seminar last night. Am I correct about that? Well, I'll try to keep that in mind as we move on. Well, you all know something about Alexis de Tocqueville. One of the things that you've probably figured out already is that the boundary of the book that he wrote, Democracy in America, is sprawling. Right? He talks about so many different things. He investigates the relationship between democracy and political institutions. That's obvious. We always remember that. But he also looks at the relationship between democracy and civic culture and social justice, family relations, individualism, educational practices, literature, theater, oratory, warfare, popular attitudes toward history, and also, among other things, religious belief. So I'm going to focus on that tonight. And I want you to be aware as we proceed. I'm really sort of taking out one particular thread, a very long, complicated book, and seeing what we might take away from that. So my focus is going to be on the connection then between democracy and Christianity as Tocqueville discerns it. And I want to just share a word or two of personal context before we get into details here. I think what we hope to do in a certain sense is have a conversation. And I think that knowing your conversation partner is important. It's one reason I try to learn your names. I want you to know just something a little bit about my own approach to this. My own approach starts with my own personal faith. And I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot, but I just need to acknowledge I'm a Christian talking about Christianity. I represent a systemically Christian institution that defines itself in the most substantive way as a Christian institution of higher learning. So that's where I'm coming from tonight. But I want to suggest, first of all, there's no definitive evidence that Tocqueville himself was Christian. We talked about that last night. He is writing about Christianity with the idea that it's important to anyone living in a free society to know what the possible correlation between Christian belief and a flourishing democracy might be. So whatever your personal politics, whatever your personal religious belief, our conversation tonight, our topic tonight ought to be relevant. So one of the ways that we can think about Tocqueville is to say he is writing about American Christianity, and in a certain sense, we might say figuratively, to American Christians. And so I've read it in that way. I don't think you have to hear it in that way to see much of value. Secondly, I want you to know how I read Tocqueville specifically. To do that, I want to share a quote that I mentioned last night. Some of you will recall it. It comes from the German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is that a name that you would recognize? Basically, the answer is no. And all I can say is you need to know Dietrich Bonhoeffer. All right? Absolutely. So Bonhoeffer, very prominent theologian and pastor, ultimately becomes deeply disturbed by the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the early 1930s. Ultimately, over time, actually comes to the United States, returns to Germany in the late 1930s to stand with what was known as the Confessing Church against National Socialism, becomes part at a kind of lower level of a secret plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, is exposed, is arrested, is imprisoned for about a year and a half, and then is executed by the Gestapo shortly before the end of World War II. In the early 1930s, as the signs are pointing to the rise of National Socialism in Germany, he speaks to a group of German pastors, and he admonishes them with these words. He says, "We no longer read the Bible seriously. We read it no longer against ourselves, but only for ourselves." So what I want to suggest, first of all, I'm not suggesting, not implying remotely, that we should think of democracy in America as sort of equivalent of Scripture. What I am saying is that Bonhoeffer's advice to Germans in the 1930s about how to read the Bible is really good advice for us in 2023 about how to read democracy in America. We need to read it against ourselves as well as for ourselves. Now, what does Bonhoeffer mean? What do I mean by that? We need to read it with ears to hear and a heart to accept things we don't want to believe are true, things that disturb us, as well as those things that reinforce what we already believe, that affirm what we desperately want to be true, that we welcome when we hear. We need to be willing to read against ourselves as well as for ourselves. Now, with regard to Tocqueville specifically, let me suggest two reasons why I think this is very important. First of all, I'm absolutely convinced that if we could have Tocqueville with us today, this is how he would want us to engage with his thinking. He would want us to be open, prepared in fact, to encounter things that deeply offend us, as well as elements of his insights that we would cheer. We need to understand Alexis de Tocqueville in terms that are almost non-existent in our politically polarized world today. I think to hear Tocqueville rightly, we need to think of him as a sympathetic critic. Which means what? That he genuinely desires our flourishing, and that he is bent on saying things to us that will disturb us deeply. Now, is he sympathetic? I would say absolutely. One of the benefits, one of the results, perhaps we would say, of his tour of the United States in 1831 and 1832 is that for the rest of his life, he has a heartfelt affinity for the United States. Not long before he dies, decades later, he writes to a correspondent and he says, "I almost think of myself as a citizen of your country, of the United States. So strong is my desire that your country prosper." He's sympathetic. He says, "It is because, precisely because I want to see American democracy flourish, that I'm going to emphasize criticism." He writes to the British thinker John Stuart Mill, maybe a name some of you will have encountered. And he writes to Mill about the book that he has written, and he says in his own words, "I have been quite severely critical of the United States, but as a sympathetic critic." And then in the book itself, what we all can read along with Tocqueville, he says this: "People do not receive the truth from their enemies, and their friends seldom offer it." Would you say that that's true? We are unwilling to hear from our enemies, and our friends will say nothing that we are unwilling to hear. So Tocqueville is going to say, that is why I have told it as I see it. He wants us to believe that he is a genuinely sympathetic critic. So if we listen for both Tocqueville against us and Tocqueville for us, I think we're listening to his words as he would hope that we would. Second reason why I think this is important, I believe in a certain sense, in a kind of figurative sense, when we try to read it in that way, we enter into the mindset of Alexis de Tocqueville. I joke and say, and I think maybe you would agree with me based on what you've encountered so far, no one ever reads Democracy in America for the anecdotes and jokes. All right, that's not the kind of writer he is. Is that fair to say? He revels in complexity. He's obsessed with precision. He qualifies every generalization that he makes. He'll make some sweeping statement and then he'll be his own worst critic in subsequent pages, telling you reasons why that's not exactly true, why it's a little bit more complicated than he's already suggested. So what we need to expect is for him to offend us if we listen closely, and for him to encourage us if we listen closely. And I would suggest that if you only feel offended or only feel encouraged, you need to go back and start over. Now, part of our problem is naturally we gravitate toward the truths that are welcome. All kinds of social scientific research today suggests that it's so. We're all subject to what the sociologists and cognitive psychologists call motivated reasoning. We accept readily what we desperately want to believe. And we're really good at justifying ignoring everything else. Tocqueville knew that it was going to be that way. One of the most interesting things is to read some of Tocqueville's correspondence in the process of writing Democracy in America and in the early stages of its publication. He's telling his correspondents before the book comes out, before Volume 1 comes out, he's telling them, readers aren't going to like this. Readers in France will often be offended. Readers in America will despise what I have to say. They're not going to like it. And then what happens? Volume 1 comes out in 1835, and lo and behold, comes out to popular acclaim. Tocqueville briefly is mystified. What would explain this? Then he figures it out. He writes to a close friend shortly after the publication of Volume 1. This is what he says, and I'll quote directly. I please many people of conflicting opinions, not because they understand me, but because they find in my work, by considering it from a single side only, arguments favorable to their passion. Did you hear what he said? Lots of people really like my book, and that's a sign that they didn't get it. They've cherry-picked. They've found that one thing that they really want to hold on to, and they praise it. I want to suggest and sort of implore, exhort us not to let that be our story. So I want us to read all of Democracy in America in this way. I want to read tonight Democracy in America with regard to Christianity and its interrelation with American democracy in this way. I want to read it both against the church as well as for the church, against Christianity in America as well as for Christianity in America. Now, let's put his focus on Christianity in its context. I'm going to do this super quickly. When Tocqueville comes to the United States, he has one question that's really paramount. What will be the effect of the rise of democracy on individual liberty and human dignity? What will be the consequences? He comes to America and he finds that power is highly concentrated in a way that really sort of caught him off guard. The majority, he says, in the United States wields its power almost completely without impediment. There's no reliable restrictions on the power of the majority. Their power really rises to the level we might call omnipotence, which is a phrase that he uses. And yet, he says, there is not as much tyranny as he would have expected to find. If omnipotence is unlimited power, tyranny is the use of power in an unjust or exploitative way. The majority has unlimited power, but the majority is not as unjust as he expected to find. Which leads to the question, why is that? And his answer, it's complicated, but he ultimately lands in particular on what he called mores, which is a term that no one ever uses anymore. And if we see how he used it, you sort of figure out why, because even he couldn't define it very precisely. Mores is our ideas, our beliefs, our opinions, our intellectual habits. It's everything that goes into the way that we engage with the world intellectually and socially. And he says, here is the secret to American democracy. Here's why American democracy is relatively liberal, by which he meant promoting individual freedom. Within the realm of mores, he emphasizes many things. Remember, everything is complicated to Tocqueville. But particularly in Volume 1, he's going to land on religious belief in the United States as the most important element of mores, wherein mores are the most important deterrent to majoritarian tyranny. So at the very least, we can agree right off that Tocqueville accords to American religious belief a very important role, almost a pivotal role in the flourishing or the failure of American democracy. So let's figure out where religion figures in that argument. I'm going to start by reading Democracy in America for American Christianity. I think that's reasonable given the emphases and the way that his argument unfolds. We're not going to stop there, but we're going to begin there. When I arrived in the United States, Tocqueville says, one of the first things that struck me was the power of religion in American life and the pervading nature of religion in American life. Ultimately, so much so that religion, he says, must be considered as among the first of America's political institutions. Even if religion does not give Americans their taste for liberty, he writes, it does notably facilitate their use for liberty. He will argue, that Christianity's ethical teachings, whether they are grounded in the supernatural, eternal God creator and second person of the Trinity, Christ his Son, set that to the side for the moment, that Christianity's ethical teachings have a powerful role to play in American democracy. His travel notebooks, he carried around a little pocket notebook that would have fit really in his coat pocket. And he fills them up with this tiny, tiny, tiny script. And he fills more than a dozen of these with his interview notes. And when you look at those notes, what he is writing time after time after time is interviewers who are saying to him that we're convinced that self-government, that a Republican form of government where the power of the government rests on the consent of the governed, cannot survive apart from religious belief. And that immediately causes his ears to perk up because he has left France, where during the French Revolution, when the French people are trying to throw off the French monarchy, one of the first things they also attack is what? The church. Believing that the two go hand in hand, and that to expand political liberty, one must undermine religious authority. And then Tocqueville comes to the United States, and what he's hearing is this turned upside down. He's hearing individual after individual say precisely the opposite. Let me just read 4 quotes, a sample of a much larger group. First, the freer men are, the more necessary religion becomes. Second, if a people is to be Republican, we mean that small case R, self-government grounded in consent. If a people is to be Republican, it must be religious. Third, religion is our best security for liberty. Fourth, religion is among the most important reasons why we are able to support Republican institutions. Now, he doesn't include all those quotes in the text of Democracy in America, but he does summarize them. And this is the way that Tocqueville summarizes them. He says, and I'm quoting, "Americans so completely confound Christianity with liberty that it is almost impossible to induce them to think of one without the other." Just so intricately intertwined. And so, reading Tocqueville for Christianity, we find in Volume 1 of Democracy in America one of the most eloquent arguments, one of the most powerful arguments for the importance of religious belief to political liberty ever penned. In the introduction, he notes that in France, friends of liberty attack religion. He says they would do well to invoke the aid of religion. Why? Quoting again, "Without morality, freedom cannot reign, and without faith, there is no basis for morality." Modern thinkers have coined this Tocqueville's golden triangle of freedom. These three things, he says, must be linked together. In the United States, Tocqueville tells his French readers, liberty looks on religion as its comrade in battle. He says the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty march in the same direction. They are marvelously combined. He points or calls attention to the fact that in the United States, the freest and most enlightened nation in the world, Tocqueville says, in the United States, the freest nation in the world, Christianity maintains more power over souls than anywhere else. At the very least, Tocqueville says, logically, at the very least, this proves that religion and liberty are not inevitably at war with one another, that they are not intrinsically opposed. But that's not really Tocqueville's point. He goes much further. There's a general principle at work here, and I'll quote again, "Despotism can do without faith, but liberty cannot." He's going to argue that democracy needs religion to flourish. And why is that? When a religion, Tocqueville says, teaches the immortality of the soul, it encourages the citizens of democratic societies to exercise what he calls habits of restraint. Now, I just want to talk about that for just a moment. Habits of restraint. Here is his point. Tocqueville's understanding of human nature may or may not be indication of orthodox Christian belief on his part. But it is very consistent with orthodox Christian teaching about human nature. He says that human nature is a combination of good desires and savage instincts. That the human, by definition, is angel and beast. Very much, not perfectly, but closely correlates to the orthodox understanding that men and women are created in the image of God. The doctrine of imago Dei in Latin says we bear the image of the Creator. And secondly, the doctrine of original sin says that we are all rebels against our creators. Tocqueville will say that given our good desires and our savage instincts, that our default is self-interest. Now he's described a situation where the majority can do pretty much anything it wants. And he says to avoid majoritarian tyranny, that cannot be allowed to happen. Where does religion fit in? Any religion, including Christianity, he says, that teaches the immortality of the soul, holds up the prospect of both punishment and reward after this life. And Tocqueville says that take that away and give to someone who believes no longer in the immortality of the soul power, and there is no logical impediment to tyranny anytime that the individual or the group believe that they will personally benefit from exploiting other human beings. So Tocqueville is going to emphasize that barring a belief in the immortality of the soul, democracy will lead ultimately, inexorably, to authoritarian tyranny. That's his argument. whether we find it persuasive or not, agree with it or not. That's essentially his argument. Do you know Fyodor Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov? There's this character in this novel, Ivan, who is a kind of representative, a type of an atheist intellectual in the novel. And Ivan says, very memorably, it's often quoted, he says, without God, everything is permitted. What Tocqueville is saying, and Tocqueville predates Dostoevsky, Tocqueville says, with God, not everything is allowed. That's what he's saying. That a society that is pervasively believing in the immortality of the soul will draw lines that curb their freedom to do anything that they desire. Where they draw the line may differ. We might disagree on where they should draw the line, but they will draw the line. So, what does this require then of the true friend of democracy, according to Tocqueville? What does this require of the true friend of liberty in a democratic society? Tocqueville says, such individuals must, I'm quoting, must apply themselves unstintingly to the task of uplifting souls and keeping them intent on heaven. Secular materialists who want to deny the immortality of the soul, Tocqueville has a label for them. They are the natural enemies of the people. Maybe if you follow American politics today, that term, the enemies of the people, it gets thrown around a fair amount these days. Tocqueville uses it to talk about the materialist who denies the immortality of the soul. Now, we've been reading Democracy in America for Christianity. Speaking as a Christian, let me just say, I'd love to stop right here. It's perfect, powerful argument for the necessity of religious belief. You want to run out, get on social media, and start quoting him with abandon. You know, take that, all of you godless intellectuals, right? But what would that mean? It would mean sort of doing exactly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said German religious leaders were doing with the Bible. Only reading it for themselves and not against themselves, which Bonhoeffer said was not a very serious way to read. So we have to go on. We have to read, I think, Democracy in America against us. And I'm using us here in a personal sense. I need to read it against the church. I need to read it in a certain sense against American Christianity. So what would that look like? Well, I think there are at least two ways that Democracy in America says very disturbing things for anyone who wants to believe in the positive contribution of American Christianity to American democracy. One we talked about a lot last night, and I was absolutely prepared not to say much about it at all tonight, but I will just mention it ever so briefly, since many of you were not here at the seminar. One of the things that Tocqueville wrestles with is the fact that religious enthusiasm, religious belief just seems to be pervasive. It is so much more pronounced than he was expected to find in a democratizing society. And so one of the questions that he's systematically asking the people that he interviews is, talk to me about why you think this is. And as he tells the story, and we see this in his field notes, the answer comes back pretty much the same time after time after time. The vitality of American Christianity, his interviewees say, has everything to do with the separation of church and state in the United States. Now that is a loaded phrase, is it not today? It is politically controversial because it has so many implications, so palpable implications for religious liberty today. What we need to clarify here is that his interviewees, when they're talking about the separation of church and state, weren't thinking about a situation where you couldn't post the 10 Commandments on a schoolhouse wall or have a Christmas tree in a public place or anything like that. It's pretty clear what they had in mind, and Tocqueville shares with us. He says that the clergy in the United States distance themselves assiduously from a close relationship with political parties. They distance themselves assiduously from any direct exercise of political power or even direct influence. Their influence, he says, will be indirect. And they do that, Tocqueville will argue, having recognized something that is very easy to forget, which is that political power almost always comes with soul cost for the church. But that is what he finds, kind of separation of church and state, where pastors are telling their congregations that no political view is in and of itself sinful if it is sincerely held. No political view is grounds for even symbolic ostracism from the church if it is sincerely held. So one of the reasons that this, of course, is a disturbing observation today to American Christians is so many high-profile American religious leaders who are doing exactly what Tocqueville said was devastating to the church. And of course, Tocqueville is writing from a French experience, from a French context, where, as we've already said, when individuals begin to strike at the monarchy, they simultaneously feel compelled to strike at the church. And what Tocqueville says had happened in France was this, that a living thing, the church, had lashed itself to a cadaver, the monarchy. It's a powerful, it's a sobering word picture. And of course, the word against American Christianity today is beware, not to lash a living thing to a cadaver. But let me just share something else in a little bit more detail. If you're personally a person of faith, then this is going to be just super depressing. And if you're not, maybe I don't know how you'll respond. There is just in Christian terminology, you may or may not be familiar with this, sometimes you talk about having spiritual gifts. And you can have a particular gift of teaching, a particular gift of exhortation, other kinds of gifts. My wife told me about 30 years ago, we've been married 38 years, maybe she told me about 35 years ago, my spiritual gift is the spiritual gift of discouragement. I can really find a lot to be concerned about. And so I just want you to know that. But it's not me alone. It's Tocqueville as well. So here's what also Tocqueville is saying. Not only is he saying that once you get too intimate interrelation between religion and politics, it actually corrupts religion and robs of its vitality. But he also says, and he says this more honestly, I think, more candidly in his correspondence, I think he is less impressed over time at the cultural transformative power of American Christianity relative to the society. In private, he begins to confess skepticism about the depth and substance of Christian belief in the United States pretty early in his tour. 7 weeks into his time in the United States, he summarizes his impressions in a letter to a cousin in France. He says that when he and Gustave de Beaumont had arrived, that the first thing that they were struck by was that religious enthusiasm runs high. But he shares that less than 2 months into his trip, he's starting to, quote, doubt that religious opinions hold as much sway as I originally thought that they did. In fact, he writes in the margin of an early draft of his manuscript, basically a reminder to himself. And that reminder says this: the influence that religion exercises over mores in the United States must not be exaggerated. It is not sufficient to make a virtuous people, but only an orderly one. Tocqueville describes what he sees. He says Americans are very strict, the Americans that he observed, he says are very strict in external practices. They observe the Sabbath very severely, he says. Sexual chastity in marriage, he writes about a lot. His experience in the French aristocracy had been very different, where sexual liaisons of married people were often considered as common. And he comes to the United States and he is struck over and over and over and over again at the sexual modesty of American women. Acknowledging that, though, he writes, quote, unless I'm sadly mistaken, these external forms conceal a reservoir of doubt and indifference. Faith, he writes, is obviously inert. Enter any church, he writes, and you'll hear sermons about morals, but not one word about dogma. Nothing at all likely to fluster one's neighbor or awaken the ideas of dissent. Halfway through his visit, he writes this. He says that the typical American minister strikes him less as truly the pastor of his flock, his words, than as an entrepreneur in the religious industry. Now, Tocqueville keeps this out of Democracy in America. He is wanting to make an argument. And that argument for French readers is, you are absolutely harming your own cause by attacking religion that teaches the immortality of the soul. He doesn't want to do anything really to muddy that message. And yet, even so, the observations that sneak into Democracy in America should give Christian readers pause. For example, he emphasizes the compatibility between Christianity and political liberty. We've talked about that. And in the process, he implies that Americans have so conflated the two, intermixed the two, that they have begun to support Christianity as an expression of patriotism. In the United States, he writes, religion never ceases to warm itself at patriotism's hearth. American ministers and religious leaders are forever defending the gospel because it serves the interests of the nation. Quote, they are forever pointing out how religious beliefs foster liberty and public order. Now let's complicate things here a little bit more. Let's stop and acknowledge this. Tocqueville believes that himself. He agrees with that. That's part of his admiration for the role that Christianity plays. He believes that it fosters liberty and public order. And he really wants to make that argument to French readers. But what troubles him, what gives this sort of nagging sensation in the back of his mind, is how commonly Americans that he speaks to, in a society in the grips of the Second Great Awakening that he believes is just pervasively religious, how common they defend Christianity on the same grounds. On grounds that we would call are instrumental. Not because it's true, but because it's beneficial. Because it serves the interests of the nation. What do we do with this? In the pages of Democracy in America, what do we encounter? We encounter a worldview that intertwines democracy and Christianity, that intertwines the United States and the church, that links together temporal benefits and eternal reward. Now, I guess my question is any of that familiar 2 centuries later? Tocqueville relates that he spoke with numerous missionaries to the American West during his journey. And he found, quote, that eternity is only one of their concerns. They actually viewed the spreading of Christianity as a way to protect America's borders, as a way to strengthen the power of the nation. I'll quote again, if you were to question these missionaries of Christian civilization, you would be quite surprised to hear how frequently they speak of the goods of this world. And you would find politicians where you had thought there were only men of religion. This emphasis on Christianity's earthly benefit was widespread, according to Tocqueville. Quoting again, American preachers refer to this world constantly. They can avert their eyes from it only with the greatest difficulty. And in listening to them, it is often difficult to tell whether the chief object of religion is to procure eternal happiness in the other world or well-being in this one. Reading Democracy in America against Christianity, and you understand when I say against, I don't mean wanting to see it fail. What I really mean is willing to say things that are hard for it to hear for its good. When we read Democracy in America against Christianity, I think we can discern that, at least in Tocqueville's perspective, there was a fair amount of conforming to the world among Jacksonian era believers. In other words, the line of interaction was going in two directions. If the presence of American Christianity was having to some degree a beneficent impact on American democracy, American society, in some sense, Tocqueville fears may be shaping American Christianity also. That to some degree, the salt was losing its savor. It's no coincidence that Tocqueville uses his observation about the worldly focus of American ministers at the kind of bridge between two sections of the book. What I read from you is the very last paragraph of one subsection. The next subsection is titled this: On the Taste for Material Well-Being in America. So he introduces that topic by talking about American ministers. What is the theme of that section? Quote, the love of well-being has become the national and the dominant taste. So let's stop and think. How do we square Tocqueville's observation that Christianity reigns in Jacksonian America by universal consent? That there's no country in the world where Christianity has no more actual power over the souls of human beings. How do we square that with this? Also a quote from Democracy in America. There is no other country where the love of money occupies as great a place in the hearts of men. Tocqueville's answer, I think, is that Americans had learned to combine these two. To combine what he calls a taste for material gratification with, quote, a kind of religious morality. In the United States, he concludes, people want to be as well off as possible in the world without renouncing their chances in the next. One of the parables of Jesus, or one of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Tocqueville is suggesting that a lot of Americans were willing to take their chance. Well, that's dark, what I just shared. I've been thinking a lot leading up to this talk. There's a modern, quote, liturgy for taking the stage that I've memorized. It begins with a question for the speaker: what have I to offer here that might sustain the souls of others? Well, this is not a Christian gathering, but I very much wanted to offer something that would challenge and nurture your souls. And I'm not entirely sure yet that I know what that is. Tocqueville wants us to read him seriously. That means we need to read him against us as well as read him for us. Now, if you are a person of faith, doing that will be hard. And what I've shared these last few minutes is not something that should encourage anyone to go out and sort of shout hallelujah. If you are not a person of faith, perhaps if you have an animosity toward faith, Tocqueville tells you that despotism can survive without faith, that liberty cannot. And you need to wrestle with that. Tocqueville doesn't want us to feel good in some sense. He wants us to wrestle with life as he finds it, which means wrestling with what we want to hear and being open to what we need to hear. And for you folks, if you begin seriously to pursue that way of engaging the life of the mind, you will be on the path to an intellectual habit that will bless you the rest of your lives. That's all I have to say right now. No, don't clap. That's all right. No. Wonder if anyone had any questions or thoughts or reactions of any kind.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for that wonderful lecture, Dr. McKenzie. If it's all right with everyone, I would love to go ahead and kick off the question session as long as we... So, Dr. McKenzie, you talk a lot about the order that religion kind of provides to America, but in our common age, we see a declining religiosity among especially young people. And in the country as a whole, we're seeing the rise of the nuns. So do you think there will be a new place that Americans find to pull their mores from, or any amount of kind of order?
So, good question. Tocqueville would have an answer. I don't know that I have an answer. We talked about this a little bit last night. For those of you who weren't present, you've probably followed the surveys. There are surveys that are coming out regularly about American religious belief. And most of them suggest a couple of things. One, that adherence to sort of institutional Christianity is dropping really very significantly, just in the last few years even. but it's not being replaced by individuals sort of repositioning themselves or reattaching themselves to other recognized religious bodies. Instead, what we see is the rise of the nones, and the people who say none of the above. I don't think of myself as a adherent of any formal religion. I may say I'm spiritual, but I don't adhere to any formal religion. What does this mean? I think it's a question that Americans need to be wrestling with. I think it's the question that scholars years from now will look back and wrestle with and think of this as a really momentous time. We're talking about continuity in American religious belief that goes back at least to the early 19th century, where the vast majority of Americans, whatever they thought in their hearts, would have been unwilling to say, I don't hold to any religion. In historical terms, in the blink of an eye, this is changing. And so where this will lead, Tocqueville really was himself on the cusp of the unknown when he writes Democracy in America. He says, where will this rise of democracy lead? No one knows. I think that's sort of where we are right now. But if Tocqueville was right, democracy cannot flourish without morality. Morality cannot survive without faith, he says. He's going to suggest at least that it will not be possible to arrive at a kind of common ground of some kind of moral conviction that will promote those habits of restraint. He himself talked about alternatives, and the one I think I mentioned just very briefly that he emphasized the most was a willingness to deny oneself for self-interested reasons. He called it self-interest rightly understood. So I will, for example, I will not engage in that mob violence against that particular individual because maybe the day will come when the tables are turned and I might be the object of that. And by my participating in that, I'm creating a society environment where that kind of action is easier. The threshold to that is lowered. So Tocqueville says that sometimes we might refrain from doing what we're able to do because in the long run we expect to benefit. The problem of that is, economist named John Maynard Keynes, does that name ring a bell to anyone? Very prominent, very influential mid-20th century economist, said, problem is that in the long run we're all dead. So we can talk about being guided by long-run kind of imperatives, but that power of the short term is so strong. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that that will be a reliable substitute for a belief in the immortality of the soul. Could I be wrong? Of course.
All righty, we have a time for a few more questions if anybody else has a question.
Dr. McKenzie, can you talk about the role of politics in democracy in America? In our day and age, everything seems to be political these days.
Yeah.
And I think that Democracy in America is viewed by a lot of people as being a book about politics. But what role does politics play in Tocqueville's mind in the social imagination?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I don't think I can answer it well. I'll just say that right off the bat. Also, I thought this group was limited to people who were born in Kentucky. And so I'm not sure you have a right to ask me this hard question, but I'll try to speak to it. I'd love to hear how you would answer it. We talked to the seminar last night. He certainly is more concerned when he talks about democracy with something that's far broader than just what today we call politics. He's talking about changes in the economic and social life and the economic and social structure and so forth that are moving toward leveling and away from hierarchy. Within that, American politics, he would say, in a certain sense, should logically point toward majority rule. But for the most part, when he talks about the function of politics, he's talking in a way that we almost will never pick up on because of the way we read it today. He's talking much more about local politics than national politics. At one point, it's in a footnote. He says, it sort of doesn't require saying that everything I'm talking about here is talking about at the state level or lower, because national politics plays such a insignificant role in the lives of most Americans. It may not have been necessary in 1835. It sure as heck is necessary today. I like to remind my students when we study the American Civil War that Americans on the cusp of the American Civil War typically live their entire lives interacting with only one federal employee, and that was the mail carrier. And so it's a different world. So one of the things that we often remember Tocqueville for, and I haven't had occasion to talk about it with the focus I've had, is his emphasis on sort of civil society as groups come together to accomplish tasks that individuals cannot accomplish alone, but to accomplish tasks that today we would almost automatically kick upstairs to a higher level of government. He's saying that Americans are forever sort of joining together. And so certainly this doesn't get to much depth, but certainly has a different sort of magnitude of comprehensiveness than we take for granted today. It's one of the many ways that his world is so different, so foreign to ours.
I'm Shelby. I'm a junior scholar. You talked about earlier in your lecture about like politics corrupting religion, and do you think we're there? Like, have politics corrupted religion, and could that be a reason that there is like the rise of the nuns, things like that? People are not really as influenced by it anymore because of the corruption within it.
Yeah. So it's a very good question, and I am immediately struck that any answer that I would give would probably say more about my personal political and religious values and worldview than anything based on evidence. I'm just going to be very honest. There's an argument that circulates, I think has probably gotten a fair amount of traction in some places, which says that one of the things that's going on right now is a deep disillusionment with American political parties among people your age. And certainly when you look at various social data, there is a powerful age correlation with what people are saying, not only in their religious beliefs, but their political beliefs as well. And so one of the arguments is you have a whole generation that is turned off from organized religion because they're seeing what Tocqueville was talking about. The only concern, I think that's a possible explanation. My concern is I don't think we have the level of fine-grained data where people are saying, this is why I'm doing it. And a statistician would say that's the ecological fallacy. That's inferring causation from correlation. And so I want to be careful. I want to be careful not to do that. One of the things I think, again, I'm a contrarian, so I want to argue something, I guess, that's, I think American society has been shaping Christianity for a long, long time. Some directly through political involvements and some other ways. I actually think theologically that what American Christians claim to believe has been shaped much, much more by democratic political culture, broadly defined, I don't mean Democratic Party, than it has been by any other single factor. So if you look at survey data today and you ask American self-identifying Christians, are human beings basically good or evil? Or just are they basically good? Centuries of Christian teaching and tradition that would say we are fallen, we are self-interested, and so forth. And depending on the survey, between 2/3 and 3/4 of Christian respondents will say we're basically good. And that, I think, is an understanding that perfectly corresponds to our political understanding of democracy, not theology. Well, I'm not going to go any further into that, except just to say I don't think if it's happening, it didn't just start in the last few years.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Hello, my name is Sawyer Depp. I'm a senior McConnell scholar. So I'm a history major, and so some of the things that you
Good
said
for you.
were interesting to me. I think that there's a lot of evidence that tyranny And despotism can be caused by a lack of faith. I think, I mean, Stalin, atheist, Hitler, agnostic. But I'm less sure and less confident in the fact that faith upholds democracy. And, you know, a few examples, I would say, you know, first one, Athens. No state faith, yet they seem to have some general belief that there was an immortal soul. Rome, the Republic of Rome, kind of had a state faith, adopted the Greeks. And then another ancient one that's interesting, Carthage, no state faith. So I guess my question is this something that is, first of all, uniquely Christian, or is it simply the belief in the immortality of the soul that leads to a successful republic? Or was Tocqueville too focused on too small of a sample, that being the United States, in too short of a time?
First of all, man, that's a wonderful question, and we could talk about that for a long time. But first of all, good for you for being a history major. Secondly, I love the way that you brought historical perspective into this conversation. That's exactly why we want to study history, and I think you did it wonderfully. Variety of things going through my mind about this. Tocqueville's argument largely doesn't go back in time the way that yours does, although he does talk in the first few pages about the development that he sees unfolding is something that's been unfolding for several centuries, say since about the 10th or 11th century. He would not agree that there was democracy in the ancient world. And the reason is, and there's no reason, I mean, your question is perfectly plausible. It's a matter of a different definition and understanding of terms. When he says there is a great democratic revolution sweeping across the Western world, what he means is the decline of feudalism and monarchy. What he means is a real powerful, inexorable leveling of the range between powerful and the weak, between the rich and the poor, and so on, like that. We think back to ancient Greece. Yes, it is a democracy for the 10% of the population that are citizens, but it's not what he is talking about, I think. He really would argue that aside from a few sort of city-states for very brief periods of time, that what is unfolding in the United States is absolute new territory. Now, you might disagree with that, and you could make an argument, but he would probably not concede your first point. The other point that you make, is he making an argument for Christianity or for, more generically, any religion that promotes the immortality of the soul? That's also a good insight. And there, he's not making an argument specifically for Christianity. I don't think he's always specific about that. He does say in some of his private correspondence, he expresses that he actually will say he thinks the ethical code that he associates with Christianity is superior to any alternative that he knows of. And he actually suggests that he believes that Christianity is more transferable to other cultures and times than other religions that he knows something about. Nevertheless, he is not making an argument specifically that could not apply to any monotheistic religion that believes in human immortality. For his purposes, again, you know, if you're a Christian, you so desperately want him to be on our team, he's going to say explicitly, the question of whether Christianity is true is not even particularly relevant to American politics if people believe it is true. The question is, will it curb their behavior or not? So he's going to say it's so important. Democracy requires some sort of faith. It's so important that people have faith, but it's not all that important what religious faith they have within these boundaries of belief in immortality. Great question. I give really long answers. I joke, I give really long answers to discourage questions from students, you know, so you never know what you'll get into. But these have been great questions. It's been such a pleasure to be with you all. Can I just say really quickly, good for you guys for being part of this program. Good for you. There's so many other ways you could be spending your time. I know you're busy. I know you're torn. You're divided in so many different ways. But you're investing in something that will matter for a long time. And I'm willing to bet if we could meet together here in 20 years, you'll say from that vantage point that there were benefits here that you were not even remotely aware of, that are gradually taking shape in your minds. I just don't think you'll ever regret it. So good for you. And thank you for letting me be in conversation with you tonight.
Once again, I speak for all of the scholars. Thank you so much for being here. I know as we continue on our debates about mores and political life in the United States, this will be a wonderful foundation, especially for contemporary issues. Thank you for everyone who was able to join us tonight in the Chow Auditorium, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us online. Just a reminder, you can find all of our related materials at www.mcconnellcenter.org, including announcements for updates about this lecture series as we continue on in 2024. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.